Good evening, everyone. My name is Jessica Boulanger. I am a transportation mobility specialist with NMCOG, and I am the project manager for the Greater Lowell Vision Zero plan. So we could start tonight's presentation off with a video from Vision Zero Vancouver. They're an advocacy group in Vision Zero took a novel approach to road safety by injecting humor into the mix. On April Fool's Day, they placed faux bricks at a crosswalk, urging pedestrians to grab one, wave it at drivers to increase visibility at the crosswalk. It's a playful and impactful way to highlight pedestrian safety. So let's start off with the video.
Ever feel unsafe crossing the crosswalk?
Can you hear the sound at home?
Yeah, it's pretty good.
Okay, thanks.
Cars cutting off your right of way. That's why Vision Zero Vancouver is excited to introduce Bricks, a new pilot program to enhance pedestrian safety. Simply grab a brick at one of our designated stands, enter the crosswalk with the brick clearly visible to surrounding vehicles, and cross the street with the full confidence that you and everyone around you is aware of your ability to protect yourself. We believe bricks will be a major disruptor to the pedestrian safety industry. Although speed bumps and other traffic calming measures do play a critical role in keeping pedestrians safe, they rely on political leadership. And frankly, who can rely on that? What you can rely on is a concrete solution. As the saying goes, sometimes the best defense is a brick.
So I thought that was a sort of funny way to kick off the meeting. I know a few people just joined the meeting, so I will drop a link in the chat to the video so you can maybe watch it later. But for now, I'll move on with the presentation. So on the screen, you'll see the objectives for the meeting today. And the purpose of the meeting is to inform municipalities on the progress of our regional safety action plan. And that plan is called Greater Lowell Vision Zero. We'll share a preliminary project list. So these are projects that we've identified throughout our region. And these are the preliminary projects that we're hoping to get feedback from our municipalities on today. And the third item is to discuss and review areas for future study under this plan. The bipartisan infrastructure law that was adopted by the Biden administration produced the Safe Streets and Roads for All grant program. Under the SS4A program, or the Safe Streets and Roads for All grant, there are two types of grants available. These include planning and demonstration and also implementation grants. At this time, we are in the process of developing a regional safety action plan. And in order for projects to be eligible for implementation funds, so these are construction dollars, they must be identified in a regional safety action plan. Some communities, for example, Somerville and Cambridge, they have municipal Vision Zero plans because NMCOG applied for a grant to develop a regional safety action plan. All of our communities will be eligible for funding, and they don't have to create a municipal specific Vision Zero plan. So under the Greater Lowell Vision Zero plan, we have a few project deliverables. The first will be a regional safety action plan that will include a list of projects that have been identified, our high injury network and our high risk network. We'll define both of those a little bit later in the presentation. We've also developed a set of region specific equity indicators. These are equity indicators to measure specific demographics within our community that need a little bit more attention in terms of improving road safety, because something we've known as part of Vision Zero is that more vulnerable communities are more subject to traffic related violence. The third project deliverable will include a web-based dashboard, and this will be an interactive dashboard that will be embedded in the NMCOG website and enable our communities to see their progress on this plan. There'll be a target year that will be set for when projects should be accomplished, and you'll be able to interact with it and identify the progress towards our goals in the plan. On the screen here, you'll see our timeline. So currently we are in the phase of preparing and developing our Greater Lowell Vision Zero draft plan. The draft plan will be presented before the Northern Middlesex Metropolitan Planning Organization on May 22nd. There'll be a public comment period from May 22nd that will run to June 12th. And during that time, our municipalities and any member of the public will have an opportunity to provide a written comment or participate in an MPO meeting or public forum to provide comments on the plan. Our consultants will be working diligently to address any of the comments that come in as part of that. And then we will present the final plan and address any comments before the MPO in the July MPO meeting. Once that plan is adopted, our communities will then be eligible for implementation funds. So on the screen, you'll see some potential options for supplemental and demonstration planning activities. So once you've developed a regional safety action plan with your projects identified, there are ways or opportunities to supplement the projects. This can be in the form of a road safety audit, some form of data collection, reporting your progress on the plan, stakeholder engagement or collaboration, other road safety planning, feasibility studies, so determining the probability or success of a project, using MUTC engineering studies, behavioral or operational activity pilot programs, and new technology pilot programs. These are some of the potential supplemental and demonstration activities that we could apply for additional funding. And when I say we, I mean NMCOG could apply on behalf of our communities to supplement the projects that we've identified in the plan. Another option is an implementation grant. On the screen, on the left-hand side of the screen, you will see some periodicals or news articles related to crashes that have happened in our region. I included this in the presentation really to show you how many accidents are happening. We're seeing on the statewide level that accidents have actually really been increasing post-pandemic. People are driving a lot faster, and we're looking at innovative ways to make our roads a lot safer. The implementation grants can be used to complete projects and strategies that are identified in the plan, as I said earlier. And also, they can be in the form of infrastructural, behavioral, or operational. So some type of education campaign is an eligible activity. It could be something like those advocacy, like the video that we saw from Vision Zero Vancouver. So any opportunity to really draw attention to the subject matter. Does anyone have any questions on my portion of the presentation before I turn it over to our consultants? Anyone at home? Okay. That's wrong. It's hiding. Okay, I think at this time I will turn it over to Joel from WSP, the project manager, for his portion of the presentation.
That's good. Thank you, Jessica. 1 second to migrate my train of thought and start controlling this thing.
I can advance the slides if you'd
That
like.
would be awesome.
Sure.
The screen is distracting enough. Thanks everybody for coming here this evening. Now on to the technical part. I'll try to do my best and be clear and not get too far in the weeds, but also explain things to the level that they need to be explained. I understand the primary purpose of those who decided to join showing up today was not really for me to fix my beard and talk about amazing networks and how we got there, but more to talk to you about what these areas look like on a map, what your concerns in those areas may be, and potential ways to address those concerns. So I might move a little fast here. Feel free to stop me if you are confused about anything. Believe me, it's all in here, but just recognizing trying to do the facilitation piece, I'll probably move a little bit quicker. Sound all right?
Perfect.
Good deal. Feel free. So on my end, here's my little agenda. I will show you who some of the folks in the corner of the room are and introduce them. We'll then talk about some networks. We will run over municipal kind of eligibility or thoughts that we might have relative to identification, general considerations as we think about things that we want to put into this plan, what they may need to look like, what they should do, how far they need to go. Past that high level approach, we'll talk about the process that we use to get through all of these risk-based networks to the areas that you saw in the maps that I presume you looked at before you came here. Once we get past that piece, we'll talk a little bit about the the nature of the countermeasures that we may be considering at these locations, as well as some potential policy ideas, and then we will wrap up by, in theory, do something relatively interactive. So hopefully we all make it there. Thanks for coming along. Hey there, redundancy. My name's Joel. There's this guy who's currently second in command on the Zoom chat. You want to introduce yourself, Mr. Crawl?
Good afternoon, folks. So I'm Nate Curtis. I am the head of WSP's Massachusetts Public Involvement Practice, and I am only too glad to be here helping out in the computer this evening.
Thank you, Nate. Off in the corner, as some backup ammo as we need, we have Dominic Privatera. Yeehaw, thanks for coming along on the corner. Fresh from a trip, good stuff. And then I have a wonderful man by the name of Zach Gavel, who's trying to remain hidden back there, but deserves his own spotlight in its own right. Yeah, let's move on to the next one. So Jessica went over a decent bit of this. Some of it is slightly, more nuanced versions of the EGs or things in parentheses. But suffice to say, what we are doing with this plan is primarily orienting the region to go after implementation dollars. Those are typically much larger grants. Until the plan is kind of done and adopted, that bucket is more or less, cannot be touched by the communities who don't have a plan in place. So the purpose of this slide is to walk you through the notion of what might be available to you in the interim once you have a plan going on, but don't yet have one adopted. So for communities that may be interested, the deadline of August 29th would be what you need to do a supplemental planning and demonstration grant project. That is more or less like what you are eligible to pursue right now up until there is a plan formally adopted. And from that point, you can kind of go after bigger buckets. Next slide, please. So coming into the second round of agenda, it's always fun. Go ahead and move along, please. We'll begin with the high entry network. So we're going to talk about two types of networks that merge into a third. This first one, the thing you need to know is that it ingests 5 years of crash history. It is very much focused on the specific location of those crashes, and then it attempts to more or less make a heat map based on the severity of the crashes at those locations. I think this is kind of one of the more straightforward and easy to understand products. And the rubric that you see on the bottom, you kind of see the scores that we're applying to the different types of crashes within Vision Zero planning, as well as kind of anything that falls under the SS4A umbrella. It is common to more or less totally disregard property damage only crashes. Most of us know those as fender benders, one where there's not even a notion of a potential possible injury, just some property damage, we move on. Those do have an effect per se, but at a kind of social cost benefit level, they really aren't worth investing much time or safety funding in, given the level of reduction in societal benefit that would come from simply not having a $2,000 fender bender. So with that, we place a lot of weight on the fatals. These values, for the most part, align with what you would see at a federal level. So what FHWA would publish at a national level. They're pretty close. We adjusted them a little bit. If you follow the federal guidance specifically, you end up with a fatal value of 90. And when that happens, kind of the map you create is just a bunch of dots where the fatals are. So in as much as a lot of this is scientific and technical, if there's any art to it at all, it is kind of fleshing out these weights here. So we went back and forth, but we feel pretty good about where we ended up. And those weights combined together to get you the location-based map we call the high entry network. Yeah. So this is the high entry network, the corridors portion, overlaid with some equity community identifications we did. We have some kind of high level statistics in terms of, so for the top 1% of the riskiest roadway miles, where do those fall relative to different types of equity communities? For the top 3% in red, and then for the top 5% in orange. Again, this is very much a location-based tool, and it is retrospective. It does nothing to try to find the risk and get at it ahead of time. It simply says what has happened, what what would your stakeholders knowingly understand you to go after, so to speak, right? Like it's very difficult to kind of make a proactive investment case when you're starting kind of from the ground. It's easier to say, oh, well, we had a camera crew out here in a terrible collision 2 weeks ago. And it's kind of easier to fall back and say, these are what people are concerned about. So that's where we'll start. So the high injury network is a bit more in the near or the midterm bucket. By contrast, we have the next one that we'll show you, which is called the high risk network. It eats the same crash data, but instead of focusing so much on where in the latitude, longitude world did this crash happen, and instead says, I don't really care in XY space where I am, but looking around what's happening on the roadway. How many lanes are there? What's the volume? Is there a median? Various other things can come into play. So effectively the way we went about it was we took all of the killed and serious injury crashes, we located them either at an intersection or a segment, and we looked at the characteristics of that location. We didn't care where it was in space. We just said, is it a 2-lane road? Is it a 3-lane road? Does it have this feature? We ran a massive statistics and we effectively came out with some pretty easy to understand indices. Within the systemic part, you come out with what we call a typical roadway. So, something that has an index of 1. And then you alter whether or not you have a variable in play, be it a 2-lane road or a 3-lane road or another thing. So you can kind of come up with these straightforward ways to say, when you have this one variable in play, taking it, of course, in isolation, right? It's not some multivariable model. How much riskier are the crash histories when this variable is present? So when we see this table over here, this is HRN risk factor, ADT, number of lanes, et cetera. These were the things that came out of our analysis as both significantly present throughout the network, as well as significantly contributing to a risk factor for fatal and serious injury crashes. I think, go ahead.
Oh, waiting, I wasn't sure.
Oh, no, you're good. I think the only thing I want to note about here is it says pedestrian exposure. That is a somewhat general term. That does not mean volume. Basically, we had a sidewalk network that NMCOG was nice enough to provide. We fed that into the model, so we were able to at least integrate sidewalk presence and the extent to which that may be correlated with killed and serious injury crashes into the model. So these are all the things that underlie the various colors on the network. But again, zooming out, high injury network, retrospective, location-based, high-risk network attempts to be forward-looking. It may cover some of those same previous facilities, but also attempts to cast your net a little bit broader to hopefully get ahead of the crashes before they occur. I know that's a lot of kind of strange stuff sometimes. I will pause for questions with that before going too much deeper down the hole.
I would just add, the high injury network data that we're using as part of this plan is directly from the mass.impact portal. So this is data that's been reported by police, fire, first responders, and they've ranked them whether it's killed or serious injuries. And essentially the data that we're using is from the past 5 years. And then the high risk network is really the predictive analysis determining the likelihood of fatal or serious injury.
What? Sure. All right, so in the realm of the planning and demo grants, this is more or less a rehearsal of the NOFO. It provides you with some guidance as to if you wanted to do a planning and demo grant, what should you tell us at FHWA such that we could score your grant to a decent criteria. They primarily have 2 main ones. They are the safety impact and an equity element. As you see here on the right, their safety factor is more or less, just what's your fatality rate over the past 5 years. This is not a kind of binary or like barrier to entry stat. There is something in the NOFO that says we will give extra consideration to communities with, 17 fatalities per year or something like that. I have, spoken with people at FHWA and they've tried to make very clear that that is a nice to have. It is not a thing that disqualifies you from being able to go after these grants. It's just something that gives you a little boost if that is in fact what you want to do. We ran a cursory analysis when kind of the NOFO came out. I believe all but I think 2 or 3 communities hit that 17 statistic, so shouldn't have much issue getting a bump if that's what we want to do. Independent of the safety piece, the other part is equity. It is honestly very funny to try to figure out how USDOT is defining equity within this program. It says you can look at various databases and use the data. Okay. We more or less came up with our own approach. Jessica had found something out of Nashville on a previous Vision Zero plan, where they had worked, I think, within the context of their Vision Zero process, but at an NPO level, to figure out how to, well, put a multi-factor methodology together for a region that maybe wasn't a huge equity outlier, so to speak, to begin with. So in, kind of this study process, you have, a few places that, come to mind off the bat, and a few places that are identified at a federal level as, disadvantaged places, but really when you move out beyond Lowell, like finding that data was kind of difficult. So we zoomed out and attempted to more or less create percentiles at a regional level that identify tracks beyond simply Lowell. Because when you look at federal guidance and you look at disadvantaged communities, there are pockets that happen in there. But recognizing that, we wanted to do something equity oriented for more communities than just the city of Lowell. So that was our attempt at it. If we move. So moving from how do we write a grant before August 29th and to what do we really do with this plan? This is a few notions of consideration for what might make a project good or strong from the perspective of FHWA. As noted, categorically, you can't really go forward with any project with your hands out if it's not identified in the plan, so that's why it's in red and bullets. Otherwise, a number of things to think through. I will note number 2 and number 3 are effectively baked into our process, as you will see shortly. When you put forward a project out of this program, it should be based in one of those 2 networks, right? You shouldn't have just done all that and then scrapped it to the side. So that makes sense. What we have taken a lot of care with and what we may have gotten wrong, and that's why we're all here talking, was trying to do as deep of a scan of the tip and recent tip investments as well, to figure out within that map, the stuff that comes up as risky. Is that a site of a recent investment? Is it a site of something where there are safety-oriented improvements that are in PE or actual design that is in a hopper? Or is it an area that is identified as risky and no one's really spoken to it, right? So those are also definitely, important not to be duplicative. Otherwise, your countermeasures should be steeped in literature and best practices. This was 10 or 15 years ago, honestly, sitting in the seat, it would be somewhat difficult to do my job, given the relatively limited lack of federal guidance at that time in this department. Over the past 3 or 4 years, I would say FHWA, I wouldn't necessarily say has turned a corner or become a different agency, but I think has made huge strides in terms of providing guidance relative to safety countermeasures that go beyond simply the highway environment. So we will be leveraging those to the extent we can, as you will see in a little bit. So moving out of the first 2 networks into what I promise is the final 3rd network. How do we make sense of any of this? My favorite word, synthesizing, yeehaw. We effectively come out with a priority network that attempts to blend both the retrospective high entry and the forward-looking high-risk network together. You will see, a bulleted list here to the right, if you understand that. There is a table on the next slide, if you prefer that, but more or less. We created 4 priority levels, with one being kind of the top highest risk, so to speak. And it's more or less this traditional GIS overlay mashing process. If you see something on the next slide with a dark black line, that means it's priority 1. What does that mean? It means it was in the highest tier of both the high risk network as well as the high entry network. So double overlap and overlap to kind of the highest extent possible. So something not to be ignored, right? 2, same kind of gig, less strong ranking, but still appearing within both networks typically. There is one case where it may fall out of the high injury network, but it was so strong at the high risk category that we attempted to keep it in 2. Other than that, moving to 3, it becomes a little bit of a blend, lower rankings within both of them, or a medium ranking in one, but not in the other. And priority 4 is, very much on the margins. It's lower tier in one of the networks and not in the other. So what we really need to focus in on this next slide is primarily the black lines and the red ones, but there are nuances that help us really cue in to where those lines should end in the formula of 3s and 4s as well. Here's that table I promised. What you see on the right are kind of the right of the table are the columns related to the high-risk network. We had different scores out of a total potential score of 10. We had nothing that came out to 10. The highest score we had was 9. But those effectively are in that rung of 9 and 8, moving lower. What do you see in this? More or less, if you move along the diagonals, you see something that resembles maybe a symmetric matrix or something like it. So really making that point of the things in the top left, priority 1, categorically important any way you slice it, and as you move down to the bottom, 4s, are in there. If it's not in either network, we are fully pushing it aside, because otherwise we'd be making some pretty arbitrary decisions, right? But if we look at this map, obviously there's concentration in Lowell, which is not a surprise to anyone. But what we see as we expand out is coverage in most other communities, to the tune of typically 2 colors. Sometimes that's just 4 and 3, sometimes more. So yeah, this is more or less the basis from which the maps that you all saw earlier this week came. Feel free to go ahead. So how did we get to the rectangles on your municipal maps? More or less, my colleague over there, Zach, spent some long, painstaking hours trying to identify what would be relevant clusters of spaces, as well as relevant potential segments to potentially cut a roadway project at. I do want to caveat and say, at a stamped engineering level, I wouldn't say any of these are fully scoped extents. They are our best attempts, working at a 30,000-foot level to figure out where these lines end, and then move on to the next piece where we really subject it to some more analysis. So we have, more or less identified those areas on the maps you saw. We had some that we'll be talking about today. We put those in kind of the projects for consideration bucket. And what we have labeled as other projects reviewed are typically the ones that came out as an identified area on the network, but were either covered in some form by the TIP or recently, or otherwise were within the town itself ranked kind of on that bottom rung, and that's why they fell out. In terms of moving that process all over, we have identified the areas. Why are we using this network? Because we only have so much money and time to actually conduct this plan, right? We've identified an overwhelming amount of prioritized risk, and that is great. So where we are at this point is we have a regional map, and that is great. That's always a good thing to look back to as you do your planning efforts. But where are we going to kind of focus the remainder of our time? And that's why we came to you today. In terms of figuring out how to leverage the priority network, I talked about rankings there. I should back up and say, hey, what were they ranked on? More or less when these boundaries were drawn, my colleagues did some painstaking work to more or less overlay those boundaries with the crash history. So when we drew a box, we said, okay, was it a fatal crash or a serious injury crash over the 5-year period? Eat all of those, weight them based on comprehensive social crash cost guidance from FHWA, which takes into account both kind of the economic and EMS part of it, as well as the life quality impacts down the line of a severe injury. Take all of those things in, normalize it by the length of that box that you drew, so to speak, and come out with kind of a potential social benefit per mile, so to speak, if those crashes didn't exist. As we move forward, we're going to look at countermeasures that seek to reduce these crashes. I wouldn't necessarily say that there are countermeasures with factors of 1 for all crashes, or in other words, I don't think there is a realm in which every crash dies everywhere. There is a realm in which the Ks and the As get a bit tamed, and that is what we are trying to focus on with this comprehensive crash cost. I can't remember the valuation off the top of my head, but I believe a fatal is on the order of like 14 or 15 million. And that's compared to things that are much lower than that in the hundreds of thousands realm. So whereas we used kind of a different weighting scale at the start when we made that high injury network, we're now coming back into a realm that's kind of a bit more generalizable. This is all again based on federal guidance. So when I do a study here, and I go into Maine and do the study, I change a local calibration factor, but otherwise it's that same basis of, really comfortable and safe, cost data to draw from. Freedom of cost. All right, so we have the good old, we are here. So within those maps you saw, other than Lowell, which is a, much larger city, so to speak, than the others. We typically try to get 3 or 4 locations into that project for consideration bucket. To put my wonderful consultant hat on. This one's a little bit different than some of the other studies I'm doing. The scope that was written is, I think, ultimately providing a pretty clear path forward on this one. We are to more or less come up with 2 priorities for each community, look at what those priorities might look like in reality, what costs might be associated with addressing those issues, and then across the region writ large, come up with potential solutions at 5 intersections, kind of, ranked across everything. So obviously 3 to 4 is a number that is greater than 2. So some of the feedback that I would like to hear today, from those on the muni side is maybe nudging us towards a specific 2 that you would like to look for. But otherwise, just looking for your feedback of the locations generally. So yeah, I think I covered for consideration what we are looking for in addition to, sort of what might make the most sense in your community or what hasn't worked, and to avoid, the pitchforks, don't do this kind of thing. Is also the notion of, hey, it looks like this in Street View and the crash history and on our map. You're there, has anything actually happened recently? Because obviously if you're not on the ground, and not in it, you can miss stuff. And it's a good time to figure out what we may have missed before we go much further. Does the context of all that generally make sense to you all? Cool. All right. So transitioning from process descriptions and networks, we have kind of a general slate of countermeasures. I talked about, federal literature, et cetera. This is a nice-ish looking slide, right? There are icons, that's cool. I'll go ahead and pass up and say I didn't make any of those icons. They come from some nice countermeasure guidance that we got from Federal Highway. I think it was about 2019 or 2020. They released a pretty large volume that effectively provides a 1 or 2 pager on 28 different types of countermeasures. Within each of these, they attempt to document the literature basis as well as the potential level of crash reduction associated with each of these features. There are 28. There's obviously a wide range of potential applications. Not all of them are going to be appropriate in any given situation. And not all are going to be right for every community. Explicitly stating that on the bottom right there. But suffice it to say, this can kind of be thought of as our menu, for which we have a solid literature basis and for which we likely have some solid cost basis to go by as well, as we kind of estimate how things come out in the plan. They break them down into a good old 5 categories. We'll call them 4 because cross-cutting is just to throw everything in a bucket because it's kind of relevant. But we'll go through these kind of quickly, but, ahead of talking to you all about, concerns in specific areas, I wanted to at least set the stage for kind of the universe or menu we're really thinking about here. I'll fess up and say I had a wonderful time, traveling through Europe in the fall. I learned plenty of things, but I am not crazy enough to think that I'm necessarily gonna come back and slap all of those things, all across the good old NMCOG region. So I feel like, we have a good basis of kind of how to go through it, but the real task here is managing, our own kind of time and focus, and getting something that responds to kind of the pressure points, I think, of your communities. Sorry, I missed that one. It's 28, right, in most states. One thing that does pain me about this wonderful commonwealth that we live in is we only have access to 27 of these, because cameras are still illegal at the state level, as far as I'm aware. Happy to put advocacy for speed cameras, et cetera, into this plan. I very much believe in it at a basic level. But gonna be one of those that we kind of gonna have to set aside, given the context in which we find ourselves.
Yes. To be good.
No worries. So in the realm of speed management, we're kind of just breaking these different categories together and listing what they are. Good old variable speed limit signs, you can use those in different locations for different reasons, particularly in different peaks or kind of dump outs from certain areas. We have for a long time kind of had our hands tied relative to the setting of speed limits with the 85th percentile rule. Some of that was addressed recently in the update to the MUTCD. So in as much as we do have a bit of flexibility, we don't have to constantly go to the conduct a speed study and how fast were people going? All right, that's how fast they're allowed to go. Good. We, have a bit more proactive stance on this. It's obviously is based on, how each community feels. It's a discussion that Pat and I kind of had before some folks came in. But again, adjusting it to serve those on foot or bike in areas where we find such people, or otherwise to, adjust them for the conditions that we see for the motorists themselves. Next slide, please. So on the pedestrian cyclist front, I'm sure most people are either enthused to see these images or their heart rate is increasing right now as their blood pressure rises. But good old provision of space for those who often are disregarded in our current system. Sidewalks, bike lanes, crosswalk visibility enhancements, but particularly an important thing in climates where it snows a decent bit and the crosswalk can outright get washed out for a few months each year. Important stuff. Meeting and refuge islands, always a great thing. Make sure they're wide enough, but usually not a bad thing to throw into the equation if we move along. Road diets, which are becoming less and less of the pariah that they once were. I know I saw probably 3 rectangular rapid flashing beacons on the way in here. That's always nice. Pedestrian hybrid beacons can be good in specific cases. People, I think, understand them a little bit less than we would like them to, but can have specific uses given a sensitive land use. And then finally, leading pedestrian intervals, i.e. letting those on foot and maybe even those on bike one day go first so that they project themselves into the intersection, can be readily seen and otherwise not kind of, impacted in that decision point where both folks start to go, so to speak. Next slide. So moving away from the vulnerable road user side towards kind of the roadway departure, which can be a pretty, grave issue along some of the rural stretches, particularly anywhere you have curbs. These are often not fully reinventing the wheel. Some of these may call for actual curvature improvements, but typically it's a matter of calling attention to the curve that does already exist. Whether that be by tactile or vibratory stimulation, i.e. rumble strips, whether that be some sort of horizontal or vertical deflection ahead of the curve coming, whether that be a sign, or otherwise an interesting one, but does have, documented literature basis behind it. Widening edge lines by a few inches, somehow it has a greater than 10% factor reduction associated with it. So these, I would say these are a bit more on the margins, but when you have 2-lane roads that go through relatively developed areas, without a lot of play, or right of way available, often this is kind of what you need to look at. We move on. Coming into intersections, familiar things, access management is always a wild thing to see as you go from community to community. Sometimes it makes sense, sometimes it's totally non-existent. But yeah, suffice to say, in some of these locations, at least that are on a few maps, they can be considered, suburban retail corridors that have their own sets of challenges, be it a motorist, be it a pedestrian, cyclist, whatever. So navigating some of that turmoil in the form of access management. A big thing on the mind of FHWA and within the program generally, FHWA is always happy to shell out $12 million for a massive corridor retrofit. What I think they like to see more from this program is shelling out $750,000 to do something that we know works, but isn't all that flashy, very broadly across the region all at once. once. So we call this systemic application of multiple low-cost countermeasures. That is a very large phrase, but the notion of kind of smaller incremental improvements that you can deliver rapidly across a broad area to really start dialing down some of those marginal events that could be dealt with without significant engineering and realignment, et cetera. Beyond that, at an intersection level, yeah, definitely can be an issue no matter where you are, but when it's dark, especially deep winter, retroreflective backplates such that you actually see yourself coming, towards the signal before it's there, a good thing. Sometimes you do need actual space to turn off of a road, so dedicated lanes to turn here and there where it is appropriate, is definitely a way to make things happen. I did want to call attention to this image on the bottom. This is one, it's kind of FHWA's favorite approach to describing multiple systemic. More or less, it's just a generic stop, right? So I think it used to just be that stop sign, but now it is a few more elements stacked into each other such that when you are approaching it, you're likely aware that the stop sign's there instead of simply coming to a halt all of a sudden because you only had the warning up there. So moving away from the engineering side into the policy arena, these are preliminary ideas. We have organized them kind of around what the client itself can do at the NPO level versus, what may be an idea for a municipality as well. So on the NPO side, typically the convener, the good old meeting space for the region. So again, acting as a kind of broad collaborator. Obviously, NMCOG has its own jurisdiction. There is an adjacent MPO, called the Montechusett RPC, that we are also doing a blend with. So, and as much as, it makes any sense to coordinate between MPOs kind of on those marginal lines within a state route that goes between the two, or at a municipality to municipality level, within some of these, muni drawings, I think there are probably 3 or 4 instances, where we're drawing them and Zach had an idea of, I'm on a margin of a map over here and on this other map I'm on a margin. So maybe those become one interjurisdictional project. So yeah, that can be a thing that towns do by themselves, but it can also be a thing that is kind of nudged or encouraged, so to speak, by creating an open and collaborative environment here at the NPO. Aside from that, in terms of the communication side, the NPO's primary power is decision-making authority and kind of delegation of funds. Within that, there is probably some room for developing a prioritization framework or some sort of equity and safety insert into that overall process. I'm sure that is a fun discussion the two of us will have over the next few weeks. But I think a pretty obvious one, I'd say, and I don't mean that in a bad way, but I think, kind of in general, that's a thing that's missing from a lot of NPO scales. So thing to think about. With good old MassDOT to establish some crash reduction targets. We will do that within the context of this plan. So that we will at least have some performance measures to go by and, try to keep ourselves honest about, currently, the goals typically go up with time, in the crash history, which is never a fun thing, but as a function of, the way that we do planning, we anticipate a higher volume in the future. We have a current rate. We assume that current rate goes forward in perpetuity. We have more people driving in the future and voila, we're okay with somehow more people dying the next year than the year before. So kind of getting away from that overall framework is definitely a guide that we're going to try to have here. Continuing on the NPO idea, again, serving as a facilitator and more or less keeping Carlin busy as a data administrator in the GIS world. I think what the Fed hopes to have happen through these plans is a more or less an understanding of what you want to do, but equally as important to that, a notion of how you're going to monitor yourself and actually get there over time. So that is definitely a place where the sharing of data and the NPO acting as a manager and admin, so to speak, of that warehouse makes a lot of sense, right? And then finally, the only other one I want to mention there is linked on the bottom. I know you all can't click links in here because we're in this fun real life environment. But I want to note one thing that I thought was intriguing. The NPO out in Metro Cleveland has created more or less its own library of temporary materials. So communities can come to the NPO and ask, hey, can I borrow a few flex posts, or can I borrow a different treatment? They will load it out for a few months, attempt to facilitate, smaller folks who may not have the institutional capacity to go get it, collect the data, et cetera, to kind of start making inroads into those types of interventions. So a pretty cool one that's an emerging trend. And then coming up to ideas for the municipalities, we have good old 25-mile-an-hour adoptions, which Lowell has recently done. We have a little bit of coverage on some other roads here and there. But I wouldn't say it's a non-politically contentious process, but I don't think there are any studies that say lowering the speed limit results in more crashes. I think they're typically the opposite of that. So there's at least a solid evidence basis to it. It can be its own political climb. Independent of that, the notion of building capacity internally to deliver these projects, it may not, be as big of a thing for large municipalities, but often, in towns where maybe a traffic engineer or a civil is routinely, not present or on staff. It's, pretty hard to start doing something different, when you don't have the space there. So figuring out how to create that space, working with advocacy organizations or otherwise broadening the tent, to create that strength. Good old education and enforcement. Obviously, we need to pair capital E enforcement with capital E equity, and that's probably its own subject of a call, I imagine. But a thing that you'd be remiss not to do. Lowell is in a relatively decent position on the education side, and that you have a lot of new folks coming here for school. Sometimes that can be difficult at an operator level. But nevertheless, you have a relatively large share of folks who can be reached and are still kind of creating their behaviors that they will take with them for the rest of their life, instead of trying to, reach people who maybe someone set in their ways later down the line. Beyond that, good old road safety audits, parking policies, and larger, kind of planning level subdivision requirements or things that really only municipalities can tackle themselves. With that, I think that was probably the final one. That was a lot of talking, and I'm used to that. I feel like I paused once there. For those in the room, feel free to interject, and then I think we'll probably turn to the online folks. Any general questions? I didn't see any head scratching. Everyone seems to still be awake, so I think that's probably good. Yeah. Liz, Pam, anybody?
So do the eligible projects have to be within, on our individual town maps, have to be within those diamond numbered areas, the projects for consideration?
Those were the ones that we thought would be most relevant. I will say, in Lowell, it was quite a beast to tackle. I think we ended up with 8 lines and something on the order of 40 different areas. So, in one level, it is informed and not incredibly arbitrary. But it's also up for debate. So yeah, but do you ask about a specific one or?
Yeah, so one of the ones in Tewksbury is Whipple Road and Bonner Street.
Mhm.
Would the eligible projects only be projects that are in those colored line, those priority score areas? What about the roadways within that rectangle not be eligible?
No, I think that's,
Because we have the reason I asked is we have a sidewalk being designed within one of those areas, but not on that one of the priority lines within that area.
Gotcha.
And it's also just right next to that rectangle, is one of our top 100 500 intersections, but it's shown just outside of it.
okay. No, I mean, honestly, that's kind of the notion of why we are here, right? You can do a certain amount of like desktop planning, and it's one thing to score things in color lines. But ultimately what we're trying to get out of this is something that like helps you all do something, right? Like if it kills your project for me to in the box three, energy, like that doesn't do me any good, it doesn't do you any good, right? So in as much as we do have to ground it in data and in some sort of basis, like this is, again, where there's a bit of interplay, if you will, and that's why we came out today. So yeah, I think we'll probably hold that one for now. I will turn it over to those who may still be online to see if we have questions, and otherwise I think we'll kind of break into physical space here.
I,
Oh, sorry.
I was just
No.
gonna say, I don't see anybody who's got a raised hand or is trying to unmute. Go ahead, Kelly.
That's me. So I do have a question because I know a number of our communities, they don't have anything that's in that red or black, on that combination HRN and HIN map. Would they still be eligible? Like in your opinion or in your experience, if they did want to pursue projects that were maybe more of a priority 3 or 4, how competitive are those projects in comparison to something that's deep red or black?
That's primarily what it's gonna be a function of, right? Like there's risk there, but the overall competitiveness at a data and social crash cost quantification level is gonna be demonstrably lower. It's not to say that, a project that is yellow isn't, worthwhile putting forward, but at a, basic level, if, a town had a yellow project, an orange project, I think the Fed would probably pick the orange project. So I hope that's kind of clear by that response. I think, the rule of thumb, so to speak, is so long as it's gonna appear in a color or appears next to a color and the box extends past that color, and we've formally decided on that box together, then I think it's okay. That is honestly a struggle we had at a technical level. It's not, any surprise to anyone in this room, that when you do this at a kind of a quick and dirty way, all you see on these maps is Lowell. So we tried to be very conscious about kind of trying to dial that out and expand it such that it was a plan that meant something more to those beyond Lowell. But honestly, you can do that to an extent. I feel like we did a pretty strong job of that. I think the only one where we came out and I was like, I feel like we could have tried to figure out how to go a little bit more. It was just Dunstable. And I mean, that's the nature of it. You can't necessarily make up trends or operational environments that aren't there, right? So that was one where, we took the process as far as we could, so to speak, and in making it not Lowell, so to speak, but you do eventually reach a limit to that. But suffice to say, Dunstable is totally fine to go forward, so long as they're still kind of, focusing what they're putting into the plan, on those areas, so to speak. Does that make sense, Kelly?
Yes. And then I do have one other question for you is, in the policy recommendations, you had talked about parking. And I'm curious, and maybe this will come out in the draft plan once that's released, but a lot of our communities, we have a combination of maybe town bylaws around parking, but then we also have parking in our zoning. And I'm curious, like from your perspective, what are different, maybe digging in a little bit more to some of those regulatory changes or policy changes that a community might consider when it comes to parking. Are they are there specific things that you're looking for, or that you would prioritize?
I think it would be more programmatic. Yeah, it is an inherently difficult one to deliver at an MPO level, right? Because it's 9 different people who are calling their own shots at a parking level. But no, I think it would be worthwhile to at least, put some general guidance in terms of how to orient parking within development codes. Obviously, this is a safety-oriented road study, so this is one of those like intersectionalities that is nice, but is also like its own beast, really. So I think we will try to, pontificate and put some thoughts down. But in terms of, sorting through 9 different sets of bylaws to rewrite language.
No, and
You
yeah,
probably
it's just,
don't
I think in my experience, like a lot of planning decisions always end up coming down to parking, so.
Yeah, no, they do.
Kind of understanding how that plays out
Yep.
in this would be interesting.
Okay, no.
Oh, that's it for me. I don't know if anyone else here in the room has questions.
Do the communities have to adopt a Vision Zero policy before they're eligible to go for planning demonstration or implementation grants? Does that policy have to be in place?
For an implementation grant, you have to have an adopted Vision Zero plan. And one of the requirements of the implementation grant is you actually have to upload your endorsed plan. So our plan will be endorsed in July of 2024.
So the individual community doesn't have to have a Vision Zero policy.
At a technical level, I think you are correct.
Because we created
you
a
did one
regional
for the
plan.
regional.
Exactly.
So I think it it's a bit of a get out of jail free card, so to speak, at a regional level. But yeah, if you're going.
6 years to get through. I'm just kidding.
But yeah, if you're going, to the implementation, to bat for those funds, obviously it may not be stated within the criteria, but anybody at an admin level is gonna at least Google it and see if, you're serious about it, so to speak. But no question.
So, yeah, so I just kind of, how does this funding opportunity relate to the two projects that are on the tip or not? I mean, is this gonna override them, supplement them?
That is a thorny one, honestly. We, in kind of like looking for those projects for consideration, we're trying to kind of not step on folks' toes, right? We did a very big scan, and for the most part, stuff that we thought was spoken for or that didn't make sense to go further down the hole, we kind of put to the side, so we will reference those like within the map, right? Like the priority network isn't gonna magically take off the dark black segments that are covered by the tip, right? It's just gonna be there as a means to further make that case in the event that the tip funding comes into some sort of cycle and the project gets into stasis. Well, there will at least, be something to look back on and say, well, independent of what you were gonna fund it for to begin with, there is a safety basis to funding this project. So it's not necessarily meant to squash any ongoing efforts. It's more meant to be a referent to further support those, or otherwise look outside and beyond the tip towards things that communities themselves might want to do that haven't been addressed.
Essentially, it's another funding opportunity. And I think under the bipartisan infrastructure law, this came out and there's not much certainty on what the future of this SS4A plan holds, but we do know that we are one of 10 regional planning agencies that received the funding to create a regional safety action plan. And many of the regional planning agencies are in the same place that we are in the process of developing it. This is also incorporated in the statewide highway safety plan. And pursuing and working on safety action plans is directly related to our federal performance measures. So we're supposed to do a certain amount of safety planning and safety work every year. With this project, we wanted to make sure that we weren't duplicating efforts. So we looked at what the TIP projects were that exist, projects that might have happened recently, and then also projects that have been recently initiated to make sure we're considering everything as part of the development of the plan.
So I would say they move forward and they hopefully do not conflict. I would say, yeah, the only nuance to add there. I feel like if we had a project that we felt was there, but outright didn't have anything related to do with safety, or it was, something where we at a risk level identified the corridor and not the intersection is the problem, but the tip only addressed the intersection. That's one of those limiting cases where we would put that tip project into that projects for consideration bucket, because it wasn't meaningfully addressed. Hope that doesn't confuse you more, but there's a little bit of interplay there. Anybody else online?
So the day before yesterday, I emailed, I think Kelly was.
Sorry, just to clarify, I think for our communities, going into this round of funding, the applications that are due on August 29, what's the funding amount that we could be pursuing? Or is it not really well defined yet?
Oh, that's fun. It's what, 3 weeks since that table? I'm good with numbers, but I don't remember that far back. I think the supplemental planning and demo one, i.e. the one that's due August 29th. I would say probably on the range of the hundreds of thousands. I think if you creep into the million there, it would only be like one or two. So they're designed to, not fund huge efforts until you have kind of a plan that is not set in stone, but a plan that is there that you're ready to move forward on, right? So some stuff within supplemental planning and demo that you could do would be additional studies, everyone's favorite thing, but within the roadway environment, there are a lot of, procedural steps and hurdles that you have to go through to do stuff that is different. And those studies cost money, right? So some of it is that notion of if you want to get there, then we'll give you some of this money to help you get there, right?
So
But yeah, in general,
it's
I'd
taking it
say,
from, sorry, so it's taking it from a line on a map into more like design or conceptual drawing to actually then position communities to get funding for construction.
nice. Jessica is showing me a table I sent her a few months back. I looked at like the 23 and 24 awards. I think what you would expect from supplemental planning, if I had to put a range on it, would probably be like 350 to like 700. It could be more than that, it could be less than that, it depends on what you're asking for. But at a ballpark level, kind of something in that typically less than $1 million bin.
Are you saying per community or?
Per applicant, yeah.
And these projects that you have on the list, does it have to be the entire project? Like some of the corridors that are identified on my list are pretty long.
Mhm.
Like, could you just do part of it? We thought we could get a more meaningful.
I think so, yeah. So again, like the segmentation was done in a very awesome way. If I can give props to those in the room who remain nameless. But yeah, again, the boundaries of those projects, I think, are somewhat up for debate, right? And that is, I think, the point at which we pull the maps out.
Yes. So, as I mentioned, I sent the maps to all of our communities, so you should have an electronic copy of the map. But for the folks in the room, we have hard copies that we'll pass out in just a few minutes. But I thought I could show the slide that Joel created. Essentially, it's a slide that shows you how to read the map.
Mhm. Hooray. So you probably figured this out, maybe you didn't. I'll try to explain it. The colors on there are relate to that priority network that we saw. I like to call it the coral snake, but no one seems to laugh, so I'll stop calling it coral snake. But our kind of fleshed together risk network map. Anything with a diamond and a numeral on it is something that we put into those. I don't think it overlaps with the tip bucket, and I don't think it's addressed bucket. Anything with a letter or a circle around it kind of fall into that latter bucket of it seems like it's risky on the map. But after looking around and doing some research, it seems like someone's already thinking about it. Let them think about it, let it remain on the map, let's look at something else. Again, the only time that doesn't describe it is when it was a project that wasn't covered by the tip, but it came in kind of the lowest, potential crash benefits per mile ranking within the town. And yeah, I think that's it. If you all need, any additional information relative to what is in the tip, et cetera, we tried to push as much of that stuff into the board as we can. There are, I believe, 6 or 7 digit numbers for the mass.IDs. I believe the project names are on there as well. If you don't see any information in terms of what stage it's at or when it's going to be done, that likely means it's in the tip for preliminary engineering or design. If you do see additional notions of what that project is, that means it's further advanced or even less advanced. Yeah. Jessica is answering some things.
I'm just entering in the chat some of the upcoming opportunities we have for engagement and involvement with the plan. As I mentioned, the plan will be released for public comment on May 22nd, and there'll be a 21-day public comment period. We'll also be hosting a public forum where we'll be hearing comments from the public. And then that meeting will take place on June 5th. So if there's any follow-up questions you have about the projects, don't hesitate to reach out. This is for the folks online. And you should all have my contact information. Following this meeting, I will send out a meeting link with all of the slides from today, along with other information about how you can be more engaged on the plan. And if you have questions for WSP, I can communicate those questions as well.
Thanks for coming, onliners.
Thank you all for your time this evening. I look forward to working further on the project with you. Take care.
Joel, I like the snake joke, by the way. That was well done.
Appreciated, sir.
You know. Have a wonderful evening, everybody. We'll see you.
Thank you.
Bye.